I have 4 pages of notes. And that's probably going to be too much. But I'd like to start with one that neither of you is expecting. And actually, I feel that it could bridge your presentations, but it may not. When you have cited there, Lisa, more than once, the dyad of Holy Virgin or Consecrated Virgin and whore, and that was in the thunder. What's the male corollary?
Gigolo?
What's parallel to Holy Virgin and whore in a masculine?
Gigolo and king.
King?
Yeah.
Killer and saint.
Yeah, there's a warrior in there.
Warrior.
I think it's worth thinking about. No matter how we look at it, I think it comes out as being very one-sided in the sense of the king is always the king. And someone who's identifying with that archetype. And the shadow is not very often brought up. It's lived out. It's lived out, but it's not brought up. Please respond.
I would.
I'm turning it on.
I would
Here, just take
I'd venture to propose priest instead of king. Holy One. I would associate more with, someone in a priestly, not just, Christian, but, whatever that function is in whatever culture.
Maybe sinner and saint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As neutral, maybe. Yeah.
I think as long as men make the language, we might not have one.
Okay, that leads me to my second question. And I'm trying very much or to bridge the 2 presentations, which is to integrate them. I was struck, Lisa, listening to you in feeling the deep grammar, shall we say, not Chomsky's version, but another version, and that is how deeply our language, and if you'll accept that for the moment, much language is concretized and concretizes patriarchy. Since we're not specifically a young group, I'm not going to insist that we talk about archetypes, but I probably should. Dave, in your experience, and you're there at the university, day in and day out, now in your 28 years?
29.
29 years. Is that enough?
Yes.
And now head of the department. Which department might that be?
That's the Department of Communication Studies.
And all blessings be upon you in taking on that position right now. How about the notion of how patriarchal powers or principles are manifest in your daily work, shall we say? I had to make one quick trip into etymology online to refresh my memory of the root of the word principle, which comes from princeps, which goes back etymologically, and Gabeser was a big etymologist, we remember, but to princeps, first man, chief leader, ruler, sovereign, and even deeper, to take first place, princeps. How are you encountering these forces amongst the students you're teaching?
One of the things that the patriarchy is really good at is convincing you that it doesn't exist. And so when you challenge any power structure, the first thing you have to do is make it visible. And that's an internal process and an external process. And so, and of course it has a lot of different sort of interrelated power structures, because we can talk about racism, and we can talk about classism, and we can talk about ageism, and we can talk about ableism, and all of these things that are interconnected, that are part of this larger structure. And what we don't do, what I try not to do, is I try not to personify the enemy. So I was giving a talk last week, and I was talking about feminist communication theory. And I said the enemy of feminism isn't men, it's patriarchy. And women can subsume the patriarchy just as much as men.
Absolutely.
And so I think to put it in Gabe Sarian terms, our responsibility is what Gabe's are called diaphaneity, right? It's transparency, is to render transparent that which was concealed. So to bring it out and make it transparent. And that is a never-ending, ongoing process that, as I said, is both internal, because we all fall back on the habituations that we've learned, but also external. And it's interesting, though, and I'll close with this thought, that I don't have to explain this to my Gen Z students because they get it already. And I think it's that crisis, those of us who have lived through prior crises are blasé about this crisis. But today's 20-year-old doesn't have that history. And so this crisis is the only crisis. And so they are, I think, much more aware, which I would also say is part of the integral mutation. That I don't have to explain this to most of my students. Some do, but some get it. Some don't get it, but mostly they get it because they're part of this mutation. So in a way, they teach us.
I had a lot of feelings for that at lunch today in the cafeteria, where we actually encountered students. And just observing that there are students here at this Institute of American Indian Arts. I mean, just the very thought of being here is vast. This is an unfair question to you, Dave, and then I have my question for you, Lisa, or both of you. Could you briefly?
No.
No. Rewind and delete the word briefly. But your experience teaching prisoners, which Dave has presented on that, this is too substantive for a quick review. But in your work with prisoners and developing curriculum for prisoners, does all this apply? Everything we're talking about? How does it apply?
Sure, because they're human. Right? I mean, this is not man stuff or college stuff or GAPESR attendee stuff. This is a message for humanity. And the incarcerated students are human. And the incarcerated students were, as you saw, one of them, for those of you who weren't there, one of them presented a work, a piece of poetry from inside Folsom Prison, which was, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that every one of us was crying at the end. We were, the prison guy who brought him into the room was crying, we were all crying. And it was because it was so raw human that those of us with privilege, and every one of us in here has privilege because we're in here, we can cover up that rawness with language and jargon, and we can bury it. And he couldn't. Michael couldn't. By the way, right now, Michael is out. He's been out a year. He works in outreach inside prisons, but he gets to go home at night. And he's halfway through a master's program, and I'm his advisor. So the answer is absolutely yes, they need it. But they have trouble accessing it because they live in an environment where showing weakness could get you injured or killed. And that was always the challenge, and yet they took to it like fish to water.
When Dave was arranging that presentation, everything was Zoom that year, our whole conference was Zoom. But there were quite a number of formalities you had to go through to get permission for this gentleman, for Michael, to join us.
He was the first incarcerated person in the history of California prisons to attend an academic conference ever. And we had to get special permission for him to be on Zoom because the prison system was afraid that he would use this as a sort of a platform to talk about, he's being tortured and all these things are happening. And so the prison, they were reluctant. And they took a chance and it worked out. And so because it worked out, maybe there will be a second someday.
Integral to that question and what you just shared with us, I'll just address this to you, Lisa, see where we go. But in the broadest terms, you spoke, how shall we proceed? Language and consciousness. Language and consciousness. That statement can be said with 3 words, including the conjunction. You were speaking of conjunctions. What has drawn you into and onward with your own contemplations of language and consciousness, and in particular your felt sense of language and consciousness?
Okay, so the nugget there is what has drawn me forward.
That's good. Should we say as a woman? Should we say as a little girl? How should we frame it?
Well, let's frame it as forward and backward. Because when you start seeing through a lens of both and, and you start, like intentionally going, okay, here's a concept, what would its complement be, and then how would I work with the complementarity as a unit, rather than each part of it as a separate concept. And so to be drawn forward is also to be pulled backward. To be drawn forward towards the integral is to be pulled backward towards the archaic. To be drawn forward towards the future is to be present to how the past has gotten you to this point in order to be drawn towards the future. And so there you have your transparency through time. You see all the connections. These are really lovely ways to remind ourselves, your spirals of all the connections. And it requires, because we didn't all live in this incarnation through all of the past, and we have not yet lived in whatever incarnation into the future, it really requires the imaginal to be able to traverse these terrains.
Okay, I have another question to direct to you directly. And I think this is worth bringing in all fractality. You work as a scientific editor. I have to say top tier, but work for the Office for Research on Women's Health for the National Institute of Health. And I saw a slide you were working on the other day, and I'm doing my best to see if I can remember it. And the acronym was GABV. Is it GABV?
SABV.
SABV.
Sex as a biological variable.
Sex as a biological variable in the scientific research.
Right. Now, its complement is GASV, gender as a sociological variable. Yeah. Or sociocultural. Gender as a sociocultural variable, which has not been quantified nearly as much as sex as a biological variable has been quantified. We're still in the cutting edge of how we study gender. Nobody really agrees about how to do it and how to define it, and because it's so culturally dependent, and there has been so much stereotype built into the methods of measurement that people have been trying really hard to get out of the stereotypes.
Lately, I've been interviewing candidates for a position in Monterey. Long story. But both of our candidates choose the pronouns they and them. And my first question in a group setting for each of them was, why? Why should we work that? Why should we take that on? Because it's not completely comfortable, familiar with everybody in the groups that I'm concerned with. How about in your classroom, Dave? How does that go?
We're not allowed to ask that question.
Yeah.
We're not allowed to ask that question.
No, my question was not what are you, my question was why is it important?
Because self-identification is at the cornerstone of agency, of autonomy. I mean, if I don't get to define myself, then the most basic aspect of me is external to me.
Can I address this? In addition to identity, which is becoming identity politics these days, I want to take this back to the discussion of patriarchy, because it's a power structure, and gender is defined in terms of what the predominant power structure is. Okay, so if the predominant power structure is economic, gender is defined differently than if the power structure is, say, religious. And so this is another both and that is really pertinent for how we think about intersectionality. There's a lot of talk about intersectionality and in this sort of northern hemisphere, it's been, even though they talk about it in terms of like this is the intersectionality of power structures, it tends to revert to identity structures. In Latin America, the medical, social medicine down there really did look at the power structures, and so gender was just sort of like a subset of whatever power structure was being investigated. And I think we would do well to incorporate both, to be able to look at both how one identifies oneself and how the culture makes you identify in a certain way based on its particular power structure.
I just have there's not much I can say to that. Just a quick sort of gapes or 2 cents.
Yeah.
And I would say that identity politics is a deficient mode of what we're trying to do. That humanizing across differences is an efficient mode. And then when it boils down, it gets to identity politics, then, it's a suffering Olympics and it's all the other things that we do that take us further away from that goal of touching a shared humanity.
I think we have time for one final question, but in particular, listening to you, Dave, and in your presentation, and I think both of you can address this, but is this national election not, in some ways, the end game of patriarchy? Is that not what's happening?
That is not what's happening. It's not going to go away that easily, because patriarchy is ensconced in women too. So one state over, Carrie Lake isn't doing too well right now, but she was doing great 6 months ago. And she's as patriarchal as it comes. So I think that the process isn't over.
I don't have anything to add to that.
There is a term, Marion Woodman, the psychologist, has the term matriarchal patriarchy, which could be usefully applied to various political figures. As virulently patriarchal, if you will allow that, but matriarchally patriarchal. Okay, I think that's the end of our time.
Perfect, thank you.